Michael, welcome.
Thank you.
Such a delight to be sitting down with you. Before we get into this, I've got a couple of things I want to check in with you. You've been out on a number of podcasts.
I have.
When you've had a great podcast interview with someone,
I see what
what's
you're doing
worked
here.
well?
Well, the interviews that I love are when people at least have some idea of who I am. I've had some interviews where they're like, it's clear you have no idea who I am or what I've written, and I'm not entirely sure why we're having a conversation. There's one radio interview I did where I go, so what are your thoughts on the American economy? I'm like,
Wrong person.
I think you're thinking I'm somebody else entirely. And the other interviews that I find are less fulfilling are the ones that kind of have a pre-prepared list of questions and we go through them regardless of what my previous answer was. And I'm like, oh man, I left so many interesting doorways and alleyways and nooks and crannies, and you could pick any one of those to explore and you're just going on your next question on your list. Yeah. I'm not too worried that that's going to happen.
But good insight.
And then often when you'll notice there may well be a moment where I'm like, well, why don't you tell me your answer to that first? Because I like it when there's a kind of shared voice as well. You know, one of the deeper currents to my work is actually thinking about how power works and how, and particularly if you're somebody who has a lot of status, like I do, like I've just partly through birth, like, you know, straight, white, overeducated dude, and then through some good moments of success, I've got quite a lot of status. And for me, I'm quite interested in going, well, how do I give most of that away? How do I how do I be a good teacher but not necessarily be in the spotlight? And part of that is going, how is it not just Michael monologuing endlessly about whatever? So part of it's, this kind of sense of a conversation between us is helpful.
So I think we're in the right place. We're ready for a conversation.
Yeah.
We'll go down rabbit holes if a few pop up as well. I've got questions and things for us to dive into. There's so much about your work, key tactics that are so useful. But I'd love to, I guess, give a little bit of context around your story. Now, I understand from reading your bio that you were banned from your high school graduation for the balloon incident.
Yes.
Tell me more.
Yeah. It actually sounds much better when it's just this mysterious teasing line.
Well, we can leave it at that if you like.
But I can tell you because it kind of connects a little bit to that conversation about power, actually, in a slightly obscure way, but not really for me. So I went to I live in Canada, but I grew up in Australia in Canberra, and had a very happy childhood. Went to Canberra Grammar School, which is the private school there in Canberra. And loved it. Like I really flourished there. And but in my final year 12, it was also the final year of the headmaster who'd been there for 28,000 years. And the class before us on their final day of school had kind of trashed the place. I mean, they put glue in the locks and they put weed killer on the field saying, F you or whatever. And I think they brought in a flock of sheep into one of the things. Of so they're like, we're just going full on catastrophe because they didn't love their time at Canberra Grammar School. And so we'd been pretty strictly banned from doing anything. I'm like, I'm just not going to accept that. And I also I'm pretty law-abiding as a natural inclination, but I'm like, but I need to stir things up, yeah. So me and a bunch of also responsible young men, because we were all like prefects and house captains and kind of all of that kind of English public school labeling. We had all of that. We literally just went and got a bunch of helium balloons and a helium container, and the chapel in the school had a conical roof, and so we just filled the roof up with balloons. I mean, this is the most benign act of rebellion in the history of acts of rebellion.
Rebel.
I mean, I know, it's like, oh, you're so dangerous. You just put some balloons into a chapel. I mean, I know. I'm like a young James Dean. But anyway, we got caught, and then we were subsequently banned from graduating, and it was it was such an interesting overuse and poor use of power by the headmaster and the deputy headmaster in that school.
Mm-hmm.
And it really rankled with me. I'm like, that is such an abuse of seniority and structure and power.
What did that mean to you at the time? Did you have that sense at the time?
Oh, at the time, I'm 17, so I'm like filled with teenage outrage and I don't know, pseudo anarchy or something around that. I don't know, but so I felt pretty disappointed. But at the same time, I was also, even then I had, it's just my high school graduation.
Yeah.
I'm like, they look idiots. Like, I'd been a prefect, a house captain, and I'd won a couple of prizes. And so, like, they're banning all the prize winners from their school graduation. It's like they're making it a mockery of themselves. And then apparently when it happened, when the names were announced of all the kids that weren't there, they all got standing ovations for 5 minutes. So it's also this idea of, you and I share an interest in how change happens in terms of, it's just not a great way to handle change.
Power, legacy,
exactly.
What we're remembered for.
I know. I was like, man, we just made that a whole lot worse for yourself by your overreacting.
Let alone the importance of rites of passage as well, which is really what those kind of experiences are. That transition into that kind of next phase.
It's like a ritual. It's like a liminal moment of moving from one place to another. And you mark it, and if you can mark it in some way, but still, yeah.
It's a great story. So your rebellion days. Talk to me about the pathway from Canberra to becoming a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford.
Well, my dad is British and was British. He died a couple of years ago and actually grew up in Oxford. His dad was the headmaster of the Magdalen College School, which is a high school right in the heart of Oxford, and it feeds choristers to Magdalen College, which is one of the fancy colleges at Oxford. And when I was 14, a teacher at school had said, "What do you want to do after school?" And I'm like, I had no idea. I still have no real idea. I'm waiting for that answer to show up sometime. But
I'm not sure someone turns up, but I still have this hope that they will.
Exactly.
Go, yes, you chose right.
And here's the answer. Yeah, right. I'm like, still hasn't happened. But this teacher, he said, "What do you want to do?" And I was like, "Well, I think I'll go to Oxford University because it was all I knew." So my dad had gone to Oxford University. Yeah. I admired my dad. I was like, "Why not?" And he was like, "Well, you'll need to be a Rhodes Scholar." I'm like, "Okay, got it."
How do I do that?
And that kind of planted a seed. And I was already pretty ambitious, and I liked being a leader and kind of taking those roles. But now I had a bit of a context, and it wasn't an obsession. But, I had we called it a prep book, a place where you write down your homework. Mm-hmm. And I remember maybe 15, I actually had drawn the crest of Oxford University and coloured it in and stuck it into the book. And it makes me sound more monomaniacal than I was. I wasn't kind of obsessed about getting into Oxford, but it was definitely an orientation that happened when I was 14. And then at university, I thought I would take a crack at that. And I was, I did arts law at ANU, so that's a 6-year degree, basically. You spend your first 3 years doing half literature, half law in my case. Then you do an honours year for me where I just did nothing but English literature, which I loved. And then I had 2 final painful years of law school because I was not a good student at law school. But in my 3rd year or 4th year, I think it was, 4th year, I guess, I was like, I'm going to apply because I'd done well in my arts degree and I'd run the soccer team and captained it, and I'd done a whole bunch of stuff. So I was like, I've collected tinsel and trophies and medals. I can make a pitch. Mm-hmm. So I went and asked what the process was, and they said, well, you fill out the form. Everybody gets a first interview. Mm-hmm. Then you get onto a short list, and then we figure it out from there. I'm like, great. So I filled out the form, got some people to write letters. Fantastic. I got a letter back going, you don't even get a first interview. And I was pretty gutted because I'm like, she had literally said everybody gets a first interview. And like apparently everybody except me. So I licked my wounds for a year. But after a 2-year break, I decided to reapply. I was a little more focused and a little more clear and a little more driven to do it. And so I made it onto the short list, which I was excited by. But then there were 2 incidents. Is this too much? Like
No.
this is like I'm turning this into some epic thing.
Yeah.
Where like, so far we're 4 hours into the interview and I'm still 17. So 2 things happened that were helpful. One thing happened, one thing didn't happen. Both of which helped me do this. The first was I got really clear that there was no way I was going to win a Rhodes Scholarship on merit. Like I just looked at who was on the short list, and they'd all won university medals. I mean, they're all really the best. And I was like, I'm clearly making up some numbers on this list. So I made a decision, which is like I need to be different around this. So there's a photograph of all these young people, and every one of them is in like a blue suit and a white shirt and a red tie if you're a man, or pearls if you're a woman, because pearls were the thing. And I had long blonde hair, I had earrings, I had a pink tie-dye tie. I was just kind of like, look, I'm either going to come distant last, or maybe you're going to pick the oddball out around that. And then in the interview itself, there was one pivotal moment, which accidental but made all the difference. I came in and it was quite intimidating. It was like this big room, it was like oak paneling. In my memory, the 10 people interviewing us, so it's 10 people, it's a lot. They were all kind of backlit, like some like CIA torture room. So there's like these mysterious folks. It was like,
pixelated
yeah,
faces.
Exactly. It was like, like all the voices were changed. Like, and so it was a bit much. And I sat down, and the first person, they had some prepared questions for me. The first person said, so Michael, you've done an English degree, you've done a law degree, and now you're proposing to do a PPE in Oxford. PPE is politics, philosophy, and economics. They're like, so what's wrong? Can't you make up your mind? And I went, well, yes and no. And that was an accidental joke. I didn't realize I was making a joke, but everybody laughed around the table, and it shifted everything. Suddenly, I was smart enough to realize I'd made a joke.
Yes.
After everybody laughed. And so I went with it, and the energy lined up, and I could become more of myself. And so those 2 positive things kind of, I think, contributed to me winning the Rhodes Scholarship. And also the fact that the night before, you all go out for dinner. You go out to dinner in Parliament House in Canberra, so it's super posh. You're in this private dining room. There are Fred Williams paintings all over the walls, and it's my favorite artist, so I'm like, oh man, this is fantastic. But it's quite tense because it's a highly performative experience, right? Yeah, you're at dinner, you're with your 7 other people who are your rivals.
There's a role to play.
10 of the people who are judging you.
Yeah.
So you're trying to be charming and intelligent and learned and engaging.
Not drop your spaghetti.
Exactly. And you're like not dominated and being an a-hole, but also like not being quiet and submissive. I need my airtime as well. So you got all of that playing on.
Yes.
And I was like, I'm screwed here. Everett is so impressive. So my thought was, I'm going to nick a teaspoon from Parliament House as my memento. It's like, in years to come, as I'm a grey 50-year-old, I'll be able to go, here's a teaspoon from the time when I became a runner-up in the Rhodes Scholarship thing. Anyway, my need to keep performing, I ended up forgetting to nick the teaspoon, which turned out to be a great thing because as you leave Parliament House, you actually walk through a metal detector. Because clearly they'd had other people nicking teaspoons before. And that would have been a whole awkward conversation around, how did the teaspoon end up in your suit jacket? I'm like, I have no idea. Anyway, so that also helped me end up winning the Rhodes Scholarship.
Fascinating if I come back to where you mentioned you're interested in power. And in some ways what you've described in that experience is actually, I can see that I don't have it. So what choices do I have in these moments, whether it is to be different in that space.
I've got a strong wiring forever to be a slightly disruptive force.
Mm-hmm. Where does that come from?
It's not. I don't know. It's there's not an obvious childhood wound or any of that sort of stuff around what's Michael playing out here.
It'd be good for the podcast if there was. It would be
good, exactly. There was this moment as a 2-year-old when a clown came into my bedroom. I don't want to talk any more about it.
No, but interesting that's almost hard. Like, I
feel like it is pretty hardwired. We had a dress-up box as kids growing up, and we had the kid I played with was kids were a couple of girls roughly my age from over the back, and they would come over and we'd play dress up, and I would always win the fight to see who got to dress up in the women's clothes, because the women just had more interesting clothes. So I always had this kind of I quite like to show off in some ways. And my parents just looked at me for years. They're like, who are you and where do you come from? Because they're both more modest and shyer and less kind of seeking the spotlight things. And, for years they were like, we're just going to wait for Michael to finally land in a pile of shit so he can finally learn his lesson to calm down. But every time something would happen, I'd kind of somehow go, ta-da, and it'd be like, it'd be fine.
Yeah.
So I'd have this kind of wiring to be a bit disruptive or be a bit different, try stuff out, be fairly undaunted by failure. I've had some great successes, but I've got this long string of stuff that hasn't worked.
Yeah.
But mostly I can just tell a good story about it. Even as I'm being banned from my high school, I'm like, I can see this feeding into the myth of things I've tried and failed at.
Yeah. And there's a muscle in that, in being able to, hold failure as success very lightly. Either way, see it as a good yarn.
Yeah, exactly. And that feels like it's been a learned skill. Like, I think I was pretty competitive as a kid. Like I would, I don't remember the story, but the story's told around the family household that we're playing backyard cricket, and my grandmother over from Scotland was bowling. I hit a cracking shot. She basically, as a 70-year-old, threw herself, 5 foot to the right, plucked a screamer out of the air because she was the most competitive person in the entire world. And I totally lost it. I threw the bat away, went off crying into the corner. I was not good at losing. So it was, I got good parenting around from my dad and my mum around how to hold winning and losing a little more lightly.
What got you then into the line of work that I guess led you down the pathway of what you're doing now?
It's kind of you can make up a story looking back, but it was mostly a random stumbling into the future. The first thing is what is my line of work? I'm not entirely sure myself, quite frankly. In some ways, I've written probably 8 or 9 books now. I've started companies with training courses around them. I give speeches and talk keynotes and that sort of stuff. But let me ask you, what do you think I'm known for?
You asked me in the car and said, how do you know me?
Yeah.
And it's such a great question, I think, because then that kind of put context.
Yeah.
So the context that I know you through is through the Coaching Habit, your book,
right?
And the methodology or the approach around coaching.
Got it. But you got the How to Begin book, and you've got the new book, How to Work with Almost Anyone.
Yes.
So you can see I'm not just the Coaching Habit.
No.
So if you look at all of that, what do you think is different or essential about what I do? Or do you think it mostly is about the Coaching Habit and you've just got these other books there to be polite?
Not at all. No, it's a good question. And what I take from it and what I've heard, I listened to your podcast interview with Dr. Brene Brown, so I know you from there as well. And I think it was almost, and it's weird, isn't it, how you kind of have these connections, but there was almost a sense of, oh, he's Australian, he's one of us, if I'm really honest, which got me to kind of dive into some of your work. So if I distill it down, and that sense of coaching is the ability to find things that are really, really complex, particularly the kind of work that we do in corporate and around leadership, around change, and your capacity and ability to be able to bring the simple, the behavioural and the tactic in a way that really holds space to, yes, this is hard. I see that as kind of a core skill of yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's probably true. And I ask it in part, I'm entirely selfishly, it wasn't a test. I'm trying to figure out a way of articulating this myself, to myself and to my team and all that sort of stuff that you do. But, you know, the line of work in some ways is being a teacher. And I think of the stuff I do, it is often trying to take kind of human processes that feel hard and make them feel simpler and more feasible for people, where they go, oh, I could probably do that. If that's what that is, I could probably take a crack at that. So it's like, if that's what coaching is, I could take a crack at that. If this is what building psychological safety is, I could take a crack at that. If this is, if trying to figure out what my next big thing is, if that's what that is, I could have a go at that. So
you know what comes to mind as you're kind of talking, it's and again I'm going to go to a metaphor, but it's providing people a map in the abyss of the unknown.
Oh,
so I'm not kind of sure where I am, but at least I've kind of got a map that orientates and can make that next step or the next pathway or the next thing that kind of comes to mind.
So let me ask you a question then, because I know you've got an interest in the unknown and uncertainty. What have you learned around what it takes to best navigate that space? Like for me, I'm like, I like to build a process so people go, oh, I can see the kind of steps forward into it. But what do you teach or help people with as you kind of step into that space?
For mine, what comes to mind, I guess, and we were saying this earlier, one of the things I've looked at, and I know for myself or I've seen for others, when we have the unknown in front of us, uncertainty, we don't know what to do, it's really natural to kind of, we want to hold control. So we hold things back.
The lizard brain is going back out and gain control immediately.
Yes, and often that's a retreat. And yet we can feel really stuck and get caught in a spiral of going down. And the way out is actually to reach out, to expand. So I even want to do it myself because I feel that feeling quite tired, is just exhale, to just sit in it. So there's some of the things I teach is really looking at three things. The first one is, where can I be more curious around this as opposed to jump to judgment, which we'll often do in the unknown. The second one is actually counterintuitive in that it's useful to step into a challenge, and it's often the very last thing that we want to do in uncertainty. But it informs us who we are, and it can be the thing that we have control over. And then the third one being community. So who can I reach out to? That whole 6 degrees of separation, usually it's 2 or 3. If we actually take the time to sit down and go, I don't want to, it's the last thing I want to do, I'm in the mess, I feel awful. But when I reach out, when I ask, can you help me, or what do you know, or I'm stuck.
How do you help people reach out? Because when I'm talking about this new book, How to Work with Almost Anyone, often I end on a call to action saying, be the person who reaches out. Because you know, the quote I heard a while back, but I love it. It's like, nobody likes to be the first person to say hello, but everybody loves to be greeted. I'm like, that's so right.
Yes.
So, you know, I've just been moving my mum into a old person's village, and she's a bit shy, and And so when we're walking around it, I'm just saying hello to everybody. I'm like, hi, how you doing? They're like, oh, hi. And I'm like, hey, yeah, what's your name? And what room are you in? And Mum's like, oh my God, who is this? Yeah, exactly.
Go back to Toronto.
Yeah, exactly. So here I am on my way. I've been banished by my mother now on my way home. But what have you learned around, the curiosity and taking on a challenge and reaching out, are all steps forward rather than steps back?
Yeah.
How do you give people the courage or the bravery to do that?
Such a good question, because you've got to have the platform of having that, right?
Right.
Similar to we all like to be greeted, but we don't like to be that. I've heard this statement that every relationship, and you absolutely touch on it in this new book, every relationship requires a hero at times.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And the repair question in your book very much goes to that, as well as just instigating the keystone conversation. And we'll definitely get to that. So I think it's that what do I wish others would do for me, and what if I took that first step?
Right.
I've had plenty of conversations with people saying, I wish I was part of a community where I could talk about this, this and this. Right. And yet the perfect community for you doesn't exist unless you create it, right? Because it's whether it's the business community or whether it's a like I wish I had somewhere that I could go and talk about finances or something. Yeah. But they're never quite right because they're not yours. So for me, that's probably that front of mind reminder, and often what I'll share with people is, what would it take for you to craft that for yourself? Like if you had to choose the 5 people to sit around with, who might that be? Yeah. And is there anyone that you know who has done that before, has reached out, that you might be able to just ask and say, would it be okay? I'd really value this conversation. Yeah. But it does sound nice in theory. It's incredibly hard to do. Yeah,
that's interesting. There's a resource I love called it's called the 2-Hour Cocktail Party. It's by an American called Nick Gray, and it gives you exactly how to run a 2-hour cocktail party. It's one of those book titles where you're like,
brilliant.
Does what it says on the cover.
Does it give you the cocktail recipes as well?
He says don't bother with the cocktails.
It's not about the cocktails.
It's not about the cocktails. So his basic insight is people love to be invited to a cocktail party. There's an increase in loneliness in general and disconnection. Yes. And often we kind of know people a little bit, and we're like, I'd like to know you a little bit better, but I don't know quite how to do that. And so I've been doing this. I've done this 3 times now, I think, in various ways in Toronto. Basic idea is Tuesday or a Wednesday, 7 till 9. Guarantee that you'll be done by 9, because part of why people say no is they're like, I don't want to be trapped in a cocktail party and on a weekday night. I've got a life. I need to go to bed. I'm now old. Yes. 9 o'clock is already past my bedtime. I don't want. I'm like, so you invite your core. So you reach out and go, hey, Ali, if I had a cocktail party on this day, would you be available to come to that? And you say yes. I'm like, great. So that's Ali. So then I set it up. I send out invites to my 5 core people. I say, please RSVP on the form so everybody can see that people are coming. Then I'll go to my next 10 people. So you have somewhere between 10 and 15 people, 2 hours, facilitated lightly. So there's a couple of times you bring everybody together and you do a quick question in and around the whole group, which breaks up old conversations and resets it and makes people be interested in new ways. And then at 9 o'clock you say, bugger off, we're done here. Buy a couple of bottles of wine, bottle of vodka, a ton of water, a few token chips and guacamole or whatever. And it's pretty effective.
What have you learnt?
Well, I've learned that people are really excited to come to a cocktail party. Like people are like grateful that you do that. I've learned that I need to structure things where I'm not the facilitator the whole time, because I shoot myself in the foot around going, I've brought all these people together and now I'm busy making connections and hosting them. Yes. And I can be a good host, but I'm not actually making the deeper connections that I'm hungry for. I've learned that one of the things I hoped would happen is that I would be invited to more things, and that hasn't happened as much as I thought it might.
Yes.
I'm like, I've now had 50 people over to a cocktail party. I did something else where I invited me plus 2 other people out for dinners. So we'd go out and I'd structure a kind of questions, and I've done that. Probably done 30 of those dinners. So I'm like, I've invited I've initiated with 150 people, and I haven't got a whole lot of, hey, Michael, why don't you come to my thing?
Yes.
So I'm like that. So what I've learned is people don't want to invite me to anything.
Let's assume that's not the case.
Well, it's a pretty viable reason. So we won't take it off the table. People don't have many. It doesn't occur to many people people don't have many things to invite people to, and people aren't that good at inviting people who are not part of the very core group of people to new stuff. It's probably more just that I'm not a very good person to invite.
Maybe not.
I'm pretty sure that's it. Like, yeah. Now that we've seen Michael, let's not invite him to anything.
We've got better guacamole over here.
Exactly.
Maybe that's it. Maybe that's
it.
It's so interesting around that that connection. It sounds good in theory, but it does require that key intention. I want to shift tack slightly. Questions.
What, away from how to host a cocktail party?
I love that we've gone there. And I can't cook at all, so I love that you also said just chips and guacamole. So I'm in on that.
This whole book gives you all the scripts on how to invite people and stuff, so it's very practical.
Yeah.
And this whole thing is, as soon as you make it complicated, everybody gives up.
Yeah.
So here's the easiest way to have just a 2-hour cocktail party.
Fascinating.
It's a good idea.
Again, it's the map. Right?
It's a map. It's a very good map. Yeah.
Questions are the tool of your trade.
Yes.
You are a master of questions.
Thank you.
It is what's dotted throughout the work that I've seen of yours.
Yep.
And then I think what it does is unlocks things for other people. What's the value of great questions, and maybe what stops people from daring to ask some of those great questions?
Well, there's a few reasons why I think a really great question is a really great thing to throw into the mix. The first is that it puts the spotlight on that person. So it kind of, I mean, I often say, like, it helps me be lazy in a conversation. Because I'm an inherently lazy person. That's also probably why I don't get invited to cocktail parties. But it's also, it's a way of calming down my need to add value, prove myself, raise my status, be the authority. It's a humble act to ask a question. It makes you humble, it creates humility, which is having you kind of have your feet grounded on the floor, but allow you to put your attention onto another person. And I think it is a great gift to try and see the person who is in front of you, have them be heard, have them be seen. You know, if you, I often enough talk about Martin Buber, and he's got this very simple model for 2 types of relationships in the world: I-it relationships and I-thou relationships. Okay. And I-it relationships are the kind are a little more transactional and a little less human. I-thou relationships are where you've found that ability to be kind of present to your messy, brilliant fullness, which means you have to kind of have a sense of showing up in that way yourself, so a degree of vulnerability, talking about Brené, but also a way of being able to be present and curious about the other person in front of you. And most of us are so, you know that saying, I used to worry what people thought of me until I realized nobody thought of me?
Yes.
Because everybody's worried about themselves or their things. So part of it for me is a question allows me to try and be more present to the other person. Now, the dark side is that it allows me to be less connected with people in some ways because I'm harder to get to know because I'm very good at
deflecting or
being curious about them. I always get very excited when I'm in conversations with somebody and they're like relentlessly good at asking me questions about myself. Partly I'm a bit slippery and anxious about it, but partly it's like, this is really interesting because, you know, I'm now old enough and experienced enough to have an hour's conversation with somebody and they'll walk away going, that was amazing. I'm like, that was perfectly interesting and I'm glad to have talked to you, but you don't know anything about me.
Yes.
And you never got curious enough to ask me.
And I was able to deflect that enough.
Or they just never got to it. You know,
Yes.
sometimes it's not even deflecting. Sometimes it's like not realizing that this act of kind of two people reaching across to each other to be curious about the other person can be really powerful.
So questions that help us, well, they certainly allow us to connect with other people.
Right.
That sense of then also being humble in a workplace environment. If I go to that context, it can be a real valuable tool for a leader where there's often can be that kind of power play to sit in that question. And more with workplaces where we're working alongside, leaders are going, I've been told I need to move into coaching skills.
Yeah.
And you talked about, you know, that sort of being the kind of person that you wrote the coaching habit for. And they're going, I'm not sure what to do here. How do I coach? What if I don't have the right answers? I need to be seen as the expert.
Right.
And the fear of, if I ask a question, what if they tell me the answer and I don't want to hear?
Exactly.
It's easier to hold that connection.
It's easier to maintain authority by distributing advice and opinions and solutions and not being curious.
If a leader is going, okay, I'm interested in how I might increase my coaching capability, where would they start?
Well, you know, often what's interesting if you're thinking of change is not what do you add, but what do you stop. You know, humans have a bit of a wiring to always go, all right, so if I need to be coaching, what do I need to learn? What do I need to add to my leadership repertoire, my leadership toolkit? And actually, one of the really interesting places just to start is to start noticing how often and how quickly you don't ask a question, but jump in and interrupt and give advice or feel the obligation to have the answer, the obligation to step in and give direction and give opinions. And just start noticing the patterns of behavior. And so you don't even have to do anything other than just go, how many questions did I ask? How many opinions did I give? And start noticing you're like, wow, I talk a lot. I have a lot of things to tell people. And part of the power of questions for me is it often starts with me going, I just know far less than I think I do. My advice is mostly a bit shit. Even the advice I think is really good. I'm like, you know, all the stuff I know for sure, they can look up on Google much faster than me, or just go, hey, Chat GPT, tell me the thing.
Yes.
And all the stuff that I'm confident about, I perhaps should be more skeptical about the quality of my own advice. And, you know, you and I have a mutual friend in Jason Fox, and, you know, his book is How to Lead a Quest. And there is something about, what if we were on an adventure together? And, you know, the link between quest and question is pretty self-evident there. You're like, so where might this take us? So, you know, the power of, I'm going to come back to your question, which is like, where would you start if you're coaching? But the part of the power of coaching for me, of being more coach-like, as I often talk about it, because, you know, a lot of leaders don't want to be a coach. And I'm like, great, don't be a coach.
Yeah.
You don't have to wear that badge. You just need to be more coach-like. And the definition of that for me is, can you stay curious a little bit longer? Can you rush to action and advice a little bit slower? And, you know, it's like, so everybody relax. You don't have to start wearing caftans and lighting incense. You just need to stay curious a little bit longer. And you can still give advice and move to action, but just do it a little bit more slowly. And
that's so good, because you can almost feel that going, oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't have to, you know, there's a lot of baggage that comes with coaching. It's like you have to be a people person to be able to do it. You can only ever ask questions. You can never give advice. You have to lie on a therapy couch and weep. It has to take an hour every time you. And I'm like, my 5. I talk about the 5 reasons people resist coaching. First is like, I don't have time for this. Like, I've seen how long coaching takes. Fancy executive coach shows up and goes into the office or has an hour-long Zoom call. I've got X number of direct reports. I don't have time for an hour-long conversation with each one of them. I mean, I'd love to, kind of, but I can't. I'm like, great, agreed. If you can't coach in 5 minutes or less, you don't have time to coach. I actually say 10 minutes or less, but often it's 5 minutes or less. And they're like, well, that's delightful, Michael. But you know what? I still don't have time to coach, because even if I could coach in 5 minutes or less, my schedule is full. Like, I start work right away in the morning and I work late, and even if I have gaps in my calendar, I've got other things to do. And I'm like, agreed. If you think you have to add coaching to what you're already doing, nothing will change. You need to think of being more coach-like as transformative. So you're transforming what you currently do, not adding to what you currently do. Same interactions, just curious a little bit longer. So then the third thing is like, well, look, I don't want to be a coach. I'm an engineer, or I'm a marketer, or I'm an HR person, or I'm a scientist, or I'm a salesperson, and I love that, or I love it enough. I didn't sign up to be a coach. I'm like, great, don't be a coach, be more coach-like. It's not a role, it's a leadership behavior. Then they go, but I don't know what coaching is. And then we give them the definition. It's like, stay curious a little bit longer. And then the 5th resistance is one that is almost never addressed by an organization. And it's the person who you're asking to be a coach or more coach-like. It's like, what's in it for me? Like, organizations are like, we need you to coach people because our good people stick around longer and they do better work. And the person being coached is like, yeah, because it's better leadership. You're more supportive, you see me, you hear me, you get me focused on the work that matters. So there's a really clear win to when you increase the amount of coaching in an organization at an organizational level and at an individual growth level. But the poor sucker you're asking to do all the work, you're like, why would they try and change their behavior in a way that's not easy? Because moving from advice giving to being curious is not an easy shift. It's simple, but it's difficult. Why would they do that? I mean, what's the incentive? Because, they're not that happy in the way they're working at the moment, but it's okay. And for me, I say, look, if you can be more coach-like, you get to work less hard and have more impact. So if you would like to work a little less hard, feel less of the need to rescue your team, feel less overwhelmed by the work you're doing, find more purpose in the work that you're doing. But fundamentally, if you'd like to work less hard and have more impact, you should consider giving this curiosity thing a crack. And that there aren't many people who are like, I would love to work even harder and have even less impact. So mostly you get some people interested.
Let me be curious about this. One of the things that can be, and we hear in organisations, certainly the role of psychological safety in order to step into some of these conversations. Some leaders might go, yep, well and good. I understand how I can be more coach-like. I can hold on to curiosity a bit longer, but I think people are going to be defensive and wary, or it's just not like anything we've ever done before. Right. So there might be a fear around that. Is there a way or a couple of tools or strategies around how to increase that sense of psychological safety?
Yeah. Well, I think people will feel like that. You know this experience when your manager goes away on a training course.
How are you?
Yeah, and they come back going, and you're like, oh my God, all right, if we just waited out 2 weeks, they'll forget all of this stuff and we'll just go back to normal.
You've listened to a podcast, haven't you? Already?
Exactly. So, part of the frustration that I feel, and maybe you feel this too, Ali, when you do this work is how hard it is to shift behavior and how hard it is to shift a culture. Okay. It's like, organizations are homeostatic. They resist change. You push into them, they push back. So this resistance is not just theoretical, it's probably real all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So a big part of one of the starting points is for me to kind of go, don't make such a big deal out of the coaching thing.
Yeah, doesn't have to be formal.
Yeah, I'm like, hey, Ali, we've been working together for 2 months, but I'd like you to come into my office so we can have a coaching session. And I was like, what the hell?
I'm busy.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, I'm busy, I'm dead, anything, I'm hiding. And then you come in and I'm like, okay, so what's on your mind? And you're like, oh my God, what is this?
Lunch.
Yeah,
Let
exactly.
me out of here.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
sometimes I say, like I'm child free, so this is theory, not practice. But talking to my brothers who do have kids, they're like, young kids, they resist eating vegetables. They're like, don't want to eat the lump of spinach that you've overcooked and put on the thing. And so what you do as a smart parent is you blend the vegetables into the spaghetti sauce, and they're like, they don't even know they're eating spinach. It just tastes like tomato sauce and spaghetti, or pasta sauce and spaghetti. So like for me, I'm like, make coaching just like an everyday way of showing up, because it's not coaching, it's being coach-like. It's not a formal process, it's just staying curious a little bit longer. So in the Coaching Habit book, I'm like, here are 7 good questions. They're not the only questions, but you can go a long way with these 7 questions. And the second question in the book is the and what else question. The best coaching question in the world, as I hyperbolically claim. And I love that AW is, spells awe, so I can say it's an awesome question, literally and metaphorically. And that question is like, when you realize that their first answer is not their only answer, and it's rarely their best answer. So whatever question you've asked them, one of the small, subtle ways of being more coach-like is you go, great, what else? What else is the answer to that? And what's amazing is they almost never even hear you ask that. All they hear is you holding the space for them to stay curious.
Yeah.
All they experience is you not charging on with advice or opinions or an action plan. You just have this moment where you're holding them just a little bit longer in this place of curiosity. So a starting point is start small. Don't make a big deal about it. Start with somebody who you think is most up for it. Yeah. Somebody who's like, we have a good working relationship. Enroll them to help you. They're like, I'm trying this out, trying to give less advice. Can we set up a thing where you're like, you help me every time I move into my advice monster shows up? Yeah. Or pick somebody who's, you have a disastrous relationship with, where like it literally can't get much worse than it currently is. So I may as well start asking a few questions. Exactly. Yeah. But it is also, it's useful to understand the reality of, how much safety, how much trust is there here, and going, well, what needs to be true for that to increase a little bit, and adjust your strategies to that.
Why is it, you mentioned the advice giving monster, why is advice giving the wrong approach?
Well, it's not always the wrong approach. There is a place for advice. What's the name of our producer here?
Nick.
Nick. If Nick comes and goes, oh my goodness, the studio is on fire. Yeah. It's not a great thing for us to be going, and how are you feeling about smoke and, inhalation, Nick? It's like we want guidance, we want advice, we want suggestions. So Daniel Goleman, who probably is best known for making emotional intelligence well known. He wrote a book, an article first for the Harvard Business Review called, what's it called? Something like Leadership That Gets Results. This is like 20 years ago, so 2000, I think. And he says, look, there are 6 different styles of leadership. Great leaders know how to use all 6 styles. Most leaders use 2.
Right, yeah.
And there is a place for each style has its prizes and punishments. There's a benefit to it, there's a cost to it. So there's a place for directive leadership, and there's a place for democratic leadership, and there's a place for other types of leadership, The one he said was least used, even though he could see a strong correlation to engagement and profitability, was coaching. And he kind of said it's because nobody has time for that. So that's part of what I'm trying to solve in that.
Advice giving.
Thank you. So what's the price of giving advice? Well, the answer is there's a time and a place for giving advice. What kills you is when advice giving is your default response to every situation. That's the pattern you're looking to break. Mm-hmm. You know that famous quote from Man's Search for Meaning, in between stimulus and response is freedom. Yeah. So when the stimulus happens, you're like, question, advice, something else. And in that, you start expanding your capacity as a leader. Mostly when you're using advice as a default, there's a few things going on. I have a TED talk on this, on the Taming Your Advice Monster. I'm like, there are 3 types of advice monsters. There's tell it, save it, and control it. So tell it, your response is, well, before I say that, tell it, save it, and control it. And you with your background will know this better than me, but they're kind of speaking to 3 ego states that you're looking to protect. And I've just turned them into a metaphor to make it kind of, because I'm not a psychologist, so I'm just making the bridge. So tell it is like, I want to have the authority. I need to have the answer. I've decided that the way I add value is by having the answer. If I don't have all the answers to all the problems, I'm not doing my job and I'm a failure and I'm letting everybody else down. So you're like, this is how I prove that I'm valuable. Save it is that kind of great rescuer tendency, which is like, it's my job to protect everybody from all harm always, and nothing uncertain can ever happen, and I will be the fierce sword that protects everybody all the time. And of course, one of my favorite models is the drama triangle, from Cartman Drama Triangle. 3 dysfunctional roles: the rescuer, the victim, and the persecutor. Mm-hmm. Rescuers create persecutors. Rescuers create victims. But you're like, I am failing if anybody is having a hard time at all. Yeah. And then the third one is this kind of control it, which is like, look, I don't want to give up control. I want to have my hands on the wheel. I don't want to let chaos arrive. Because if I'm not controlling everything all the time, the universe crumbles and chaos and all its mighty form will appear.
I've got all the proof.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, yeah.
And the truth is, all 3 of those have origins in something helpful. Like, it is helpful to go, I'm trying to figure out no answers. And it is helpful to be oriented to be helpful. Mm-hmm. And it is helpful to go, actually, I'm trying to impose a little order on the chaos of life. But when they become your default drivers and your default responses, suddenly there's a dynamic where you're really saying, look, I'm better and smarter and faster and clever and wiser and more experienced or younger or more vital than you. I'm better than you. Mm. So the deepest rhythm here is like, I'm better than you are. I'm claiming the space and claiming the authority. I'm not allowing you to step into the light and figure this stuff out for yourself. Because I like the certainty and control and the sense of virtuousness I get from giving the answers.
That's what you're looking for from me. That's what my role is.
And there's a place for advice giving. It's the default response to it. Mm-hmm. How quickly we move to it without even realizing we're doing it. That's the thing to try and become a little more aware of.
Notice it for yourself. Yeah. There are definitely times that can show up and go, actually, what if I'd sat in it a little bit longer? Sometimes it could just be time. I'll just tell you what to do. I can't sit in here.
So sometimes that's the reality.
Yes.
But it's did you make that choice or did you just default to it?
Yeah.
Because it can be really helpful. Like if you come in and go, Michael, I've got this challenge, and I'm like, Ali, I've got 3 minutes before I need to leave to the next thing. Mm. So part of me wants to ask you a question so you figure it out yourself, but let me give you my best guess now to the answer, and that's all I can give you right now. So I want to help you. I've made a choice about how to deal with it rather than just going, whenever Ali asks, I tell her the answer.
Yeah, but even in that, you're talking about, I would like to ask a question.
Yeah.
So recognizing that for the other person. Yeah. Let's shift now to your latest book, which is called... the title is amazing. It's remarkable.
It is amazing. It's like, I mean, to everybody listening, we were talking about this beforehand, which is like the quest to name a book is ruthlessly difficult. I mean, you spend 9 months writing a book and 9 months also trying to come up with the name of your book, because in 5 words or less, you've got to somehow summarize the problem and the solution and make it sound interesting and make it sound different.
So you've nailed this.
I have.
How to work with almost anyone. So much I want to dive into this, but let's start with the almost.
Yeah.
What does the almost tell us?
Well, what does it tell us? What does it tell you?
And I think this is part of the genius in the title, but there are people who go, so I don't have to be, it's not the Pollyanna effect, right?
Yeah.
It does hold space that it's not always going to work all the time.
No, everybody's got some almost people in their lives where you're like, I don't want to work with this person. They're a sociopath or they're a nightmare or we're just never going to work. And I'm like, that's great. Whoever those people are, I get it. That leaves everybody else. There's still a lot of people. And also, how could I write a book called How to Work with Anyone? I mean, does that feel believable to you? It doesn't feel believable to me. I would pick up a book called How to Work with Anyone with a sneered lip and a rolled eye, because I'm like, you're blowing smoke at this stage because nobody knows how to work with anyone.
Yes.
But I'm like...
But almost anyone?
But almost anyone.
Yeah.
And the other promise in the book is not how to make every working relationship perfect. It's not one of those relationship books where you see two couples backlit against a Gold Coast sunset or anything like that. It's like, this is about how do you work with the hard people? How do you work with the people who are kind of whatever in the middle? How do you keep the brilliant working relationships as good as they can be for as long as they can be? It's like, how do you maximize the potential in all of the key working relationships you have, so that some of the bad ones become bearable, as an example.
And you wrap that up in it's a really great kind of almost stake in the ground to say it's the best possible relationship. Yep. And that will be different, that will be varied based on the context, based on your intention around that, where the unbearable become bearable. Maybe that's the best possible relationship. But I mean,
you and I would have a certain amount of potential in how we work together. So if we were plotting and planning something together, we're like, so what's the best version of this look like for you and me? Mm-hmm. And then if I'm doing it, I'm going, after this, I'm going to go hang out with my friend Phil. And if Phil and I were doing it, and, we met today.
Yes.
I met Phil when we were 3. Yes. So we've known each other for 52 years. There's just a whole bunch of different things
the possibility within that's quite different.
But if I was working with you, like if you said, Michael, I've got this idea, we want to co-host a podcast together. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, maybe. And you're like, so how would we work together if we were doing a podcast? Because what's tempting is just to start talking about the podcast.
What's it going to be called? What color is it going to be?
Exactly. Who do we have as guests? Are we going to have guests? Are 3 cameras enough? Should we get a 7 camera
we
set
need that
up?
Drone.
So it's like a Matrix thing. We could do bullet time. Yeah. We could call it bullet time. Suddenly, I'm like, so I love ideas.
Rush to the ideas without pausing. Yeah.
And we're like, when you've had a really good working partnership, what have you learned? You work with your husband. Mm-hmm. Like, I worked with my wife for a while. Best of times, worst of times. Mm-hmm. Like when it's good, it's magical. When it's bad, it's brutal.
Yes.
Right? So I'm like, so what have you learned about the best of times working with somebody like you? What do you do? What do I do? Well, what does the other person do? What's the best of that look like? And when you've had really hard working relationships, when you're co-creating something, what have you learned from that? And I mean, this is the basic idea. In the book, there are questions and other exercises and stuff.
Well, let's go to some of those.
Sure.
Like you've got these 5 questions with the aim of getting to the best possible relationship. Yeah. Can you unpack those 5?
Sure. So the key idea of the book is have a conversation about how you work together before you start working. Or if you're already working with the person, stop for a moment and have a conversation about how you want to work together before you resume working. So that's the key idea and the key tactic. And then in the book, there are here are 5 helpful questions, perhaps. There's the amplify question, which is what's your best. There's the steady question, which is what are your practices and preferences. There's the good date and the bad date question, which is what can we learn from past successful relationships and what can we learn from past frustrating relationships. And then there's the repair question, which is how will we fix it when things go wrong. And what you're doing in this is creating an exchange of information. So you actually, it kind of comes back to what we were saying before about questions allow you to see the other person. Rather than just making up a whole bunch of stuff. I met Ellie today, so I don't really know her, but we've name-dropped people that we know together, like Brené Brown and Jason Fox. She's wearing a kind of cool leather thing. I'm wearing a wholly blue sweater because I tore a hole in it coming up here. I'm wearing a pearl necklace. She's wearing stylish jewelry. So we've already made up a whole bunch of stuff about each other. We've found connection. We've got questions. And what this does is let's actually get more nitty-gritty about what's true about how we operate in this world. Because I just don't know. I could make stuff up at you, but I just don't know. And that's true for me.
But how often that happens in workplaces, right? The
it's
assumptions.
Every single moment of every relationship, which is okay, we've got to get on with the work. Yeah, okay, I get it. All right. I kind of get a sense of who you are. Some of it's bound to be right. Let's click on. And this just gives you a chance of, the 3 attributes of a BPR, a best possible relationship, is it needs to be safe, it needs to be vital, meaning alive, and it needs to be repairable, so that when it does get dented, it has a chance of being fixed. And this exchange of information, everything from tell me about when you shine and when you flow. What does that even look like? What are you doing? Who are you doing it with?
Do you find that people are able, because some of those require some thought, right?
Yeah, this is a bit of a self-help book, cunningly disguised as a business book, because every one of the 5 questions has 3 exercises connected to it, designed to help you find better language and deeper insight as to, who are you actually? Because the more specific you can be around stuff, the more helpful that is for you and for the other person. So there are sometimes when I'm teaching this, I'll often teach the first question, the amplify question, what's your best? And the sub-questions on it are when do you shine and when do you flow? The flow state, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, this Czech psychologist with a very long, complicated name, or when you shine, it's kind of you seeing the other person kind of lit up and in their zone. And some people, when you go, well, tell me about that, they're like, I can tell you exactly about that, because they've been doing this self-help, self-discovery stuff forever, and they're like, I'm glad you asked. I've been waiting my lifetime for somebody to allow me to talk about that. And lots of people are like, I can make some stuff up, but I don't really know. So I'm like, great, so let's get into it. Let's take some guesses, start articulating that, because you need to go through the crappy first draft version of when you shine and when you flow before you get a more nuanced response to it.
And we're obviously sitting here in Australia. Some of that is a bit un-Australian to kind of talk about.
Yeah, it's a bit on every culture in the world, quite frankly. Last night I ran a webinar for 200 people in Finland, and I don't know if have you ever been to Finland or taught in Finland? So they're pretty wired to be quiet and slightly introverted. There's a joke. I went there when Nokia was a big thing, and I did a bit of work for them. And I told them I was heading up north to teach in Lapland, some of the engineers. They're like, oh. And then they told me this joke. The difference between an introverted Finnish person and an extroverted one? The extroverted Finnish person looks at your shoes rather than their shoes when they're talking to you. So when you head up north where everybody's really introverted and they're all tech engineers and they're all in a big theater, I couldn't even see anybody's eyes. I was like, this is the quietest group I've ever done, because I'm kind of like interactive and performing, and I'm like, I am dying here. And then afterwards the manager was like, I have never seen them so engaged. That was amazing. I was like, okay. So
nailed it.
All of that to say,
it's not comfortable.
I don't think there's a single culture in the world where they're like, I am just delighted to start telling you about how awesome I am.
Yeah.
But
in the context of being able to say, how do I shine?
And in the context of saying, I just want to tell you how when I light up so that you can work better with me. It's not in the context of, let me tell you how awesome I am just because I want you to feel small. It's not about being a blowhard or a blackguard. I'm just trying to tell you this is me at my best, because I'd love to hear what you are at your best, and if you know what I am at my best, we've just got a whole lot of information that's going to give us a better chance to really zing.
What are you at your best? What comes to mind?
For me, how would I answer that? Well, there's a few different answers I have for that. One is being a teacher. So I'm pretty good with teaching a crowd because I'm a good facilitator, and I have moments of being funny, and I'm quite playful with a group, and I can often read a room and kind of meet the energy where it needs to be and kind of tease people a little bit, but not in a way that gets too much. So that's a good moment, like particularly when I'm in a room, kind of working. That's one of the ways I'm at my best. One of the ways I'm at my best is when I'm in a room by myself and I'm trying to find the shape of an idea. You know, all of the books you got in front of you here, before I wrote any real words, for each one I just went through sheets and sheets of paper of just drawing boxes and trying to find the shape of what I was trying to write and teach. And you know, when I look back on it, I'm like, I've just written the same thing, you know, like 280 times. I was like, it was ridiculous how many iterations and repetitions it took me. But it's like I'm just trying to find the clearest arc, the cleanest expression of what this idea is.
And as I'm sitting here, like, you know, this was a part of that conversation, I'm going, oh, so even the language around shape and space and time, right, and you being able to sit with that on your own, then I can understand that and go, great.
Yeah, because, I mean, this is vaguely ironic, but, you know, for me, one of the ways I work well with people is not working with people.
Yeah.
Like, meetings drive me nuts. I'm terrible in meetings. And I spend quite a lot of time just me in a room by myself with bits of paper, sketching stuff out. And I really like that. That's not the whole thing for me, but it's a big part of it for me. And that will be surprising to a lot of people because people think I'm far more, you know, wanting to mix it up with other people than I probably am.
So that becomes so insightful as an amplifying starting point. The second question is the steady question.
Yeah.
Where does that kind of guide a conversation?
So it just talks about the mechanics of how you work, because we've all developed, you know, micro habits and micro preferences, and there's so much technology, so there's so many different ways of doing everything that it's really helpful just to go. Like, here's an answer, a question I should have asked you and I didn't, which is, do you prefer Alison or Ali? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I've got it in my head that it's both of those. And there's a tiny bit of me, it's like, every time I say Ali, am I annoying her? Because I don't like to be called Mike. I like to be called Michael. So, you know, this is like, I have a complicated, it's not that complicated, but it becomes complicated. Yeah. My surname is Bungay Stanier because when I got married, I took my wife's surname. We didn't put a hyphen in it. So it's an invisible hyphen. So, A, the length of it freaks people out. They're like, how do you pronounce it? I'm anxious about it. B, it gets misspelt all the time. So, you know, Bungay Stainer is a classic. Michael Banging Spaniel is the best one ever. I'm like, I don't know how you came up with that, but it's good. I acknowledge that. And I'm like, so, look, and, you know, it's Michael, it's Bungay Stanier. Now we talk about what our pronouns are. You know, I never did that 10 years ago. It never even crossed my mind. But now it becomes one of those things where I'm like, it's actually helpful to go,
yes,
you know, do you want to tell me what your pronouns are? Are they different from what's going to be obvious? Right down to things like, you know, I have an assistant, luckily, and we use Asana, it's a project management tool. And so Claudine will often end up putting things for me to do in my Asana. Now, years ago, I worked with a guy called David Allen who wrote Getting Things Done, kind of one of the productivity gurus from 20 years ago. And one of his lessons was every to-do should start with a verb. Like, otherwise, how would you know what to do? If there's not a doing word in the thing, it's not a to-do. And now I am weirdly touchy about that. So anytime I get a to-do without a verb, I'm like, spit the dummy, throw the whatever on the floor. I'm like, this is ridiculous. So Claudine knows that. So, and that's what comes out in questions like this, which is like, how do we do this? How do we interact? You know, if I'm sending you emails on a Saturday, what does that mean? Do we make it up? Yeah.
These are so important questions. They're ones that, you know, occasionally, not always, I haven't done it perfectly, but we've done it well with our team. And I have my version of Claudine is Tracy. She's the greatest EA on the planet, and anyone that I rave about her to, I'm like, you're not allowed to steal her. And
Tracy's not even her real name. You're like, it's just a pseudonym that you put out when you talk about this other person. Exactly.
She is remarkable, and she already knows she's on the lifetime contract because she knows my life better than I do, and we've had over the years been able to have some of those conversations, but even a little bit like Claudine, one of the things she said, if I send you a text, I just need to know that you've got it. So I don't I don't sleep unless you give me a thumbs up.
Yeah,
and that's all I need. The moment I know that, and every time I do it, I'm like, oh, I'm helping her.
Exactly.
And I know it, and it's really clear, and she's not frustrated by it.
There's all these little ways of doing kind of, I think of it as micro tears in the relationship. And none of them are fatal. Like, it's not like when you don't give a thumbs up to Tracy, she's like, I'm definitely resigning now. Plus, I have all these offers from all these other people who, so I can take my pick and choose. Like, Tracy, you could double your salary somewhere. You just need to ask.
Thumbs up.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like, if you, the fewer micro tears you have, the less repairing you need to do, the more robust it keeps going. So you're like, I just know these things. Like, some people I work with, I'm like, it's important for me to ask about their child and have that conversation. Some people, they're like, I'd rather you didn't, because I'm like, I'm private and I want to crack on with other stuff.
Yeah. Yep.
And so you just figure some of the stuff out.
Yeah. The third and fourth question, and we've touched on a little bit just around when, what relationships, the best and worst date questions. When it's gone well, what does that look like? When it hasn't gone well, what are those frustration points?
Basically, you're noticing that the patterns from the past repeat again in the future. It's really annoying. They get a little more subtle, perhaps, as you become more adept in your own life. But it's one of those patterns that it's like the same basic stuff, the same dysfunction and the same function keeps showing up. So rather than hiding it, why not talk about it? Like, when I sit down with people and go, let me tell you exactly how I will screw you over in this relationship. Because I've done it with every relationship so far, and you're not going to be an exception to that. This will be the pattern. It'll start like this, it'll go like that, it'll go like this. Here's how you manage me through this. So for both of our sakes. So I can be really articulate about what it means to work with me. And for the people who I work with, they're typically people who I've hired because I've got two small little companies, so they're interacting with me in some way. So it means that I've got a lot of authority and power in that. So there's something really powerful in the degree of vulnerability, if you want to use that word, or just kind of openness around that, around what it gives permission to do. I also send people to go and talk to other people who've worked with me. It's like, go and talk to these people about the reality of working with me. Because there is also a truth that sometimes when people show up, they're a little bit, oh, this is great. I've heard him on a podcast and he sounds so nice. I'm like, I am nice, but I'm also complicated and unreliable and, irritating at times as well. And so you need to find the reality of that. But the good date and the bad date question is like, you've experienced really hard relationships. Talk about those. share what's useful. Often what's interesting with the bad relationships is to talk about how your role in that. So often with bad relationships, we just want to blame the other person. It's like, I was this flawless paladin of nobility, and they were just
unreasonable.
They were the opposite of that. And you're like, you probably had some role in that. So what was your role in the dysfunction? And when you're talking about the good relationships, talk about the other person's role. What did they do to make such a great relationship with you? It's counterintuitive. It's not our natural bias. A natural bias is we take more credit for the good stuff and less credit for the bad stuff. So we're just flipping that deliberately.
One of the big aha moments for me in reading this book was this realization. You said that this conversation works best when you're both sharing. And so often you've got those 5 questions, and we talked before about the power of questions, but also the kryptonite of questions means that you can become unknown.
Yeah.
And you've got a lot of information about the other person.
That's right.
And so this aha of going, actually, it's so important for you to be open and share. There are components where at times I'm not the best in relationships. I know for me personally, I'll go quiet, I disappear. Which means I'm absent, and actually there's power in the absence, right? Like I can hold that, which is completely unfair for the other person. But being able to that requires a two-way street.
I mean, the origin of this work for me is from a guy called Peter Block, who's one of my favorite writers. In all of his work, his shadow is over all of my stuff, and he talks about something called a social contract, which is a version of this idea of a keystone conversation. I didn't love social contract because it's a bit abstract and it's a bit legalistic, and are we talking about Hobbes and philosophy, or we're talking about something else? But the insightful word in that is contract, because a contract, I mean, I finished law school being sued by one of my lecturers for defamation, so don't take anything I say about law to be accurate. But I do remember that a contract is an equal exchange of value. The two of you are trading something with each other. And if this is some form of a contract between the two of you, there needs to be an equal exchange of information. So you need to ask and answer, so that there's a sense of, and this kind of connects back to the power thing a little bit, which is like, this is actually a way that hierarchy gets distorted a little, or not distorted, broken down a little bit, because there's this human exchange.
The keystone conversation is what you talk about in terms of this being the space and place you might ask those 5 questions, or at least provide the opportunity to have a conversation. How do you prepare for, and you've got so many great resources and tools, but if someone's listening going, okay, I'm interested, I've heard some of those questions, I'm going to tap into the book. How do we prepare for a keystone conversation? Do you let people know? Do you ambush them with it?
You totally ambush them. You're like, they're just walking on the corridor.
And make sure your seat's closer to the door.
Room with a very bright light, and you're like, here's a question for you.
We're not going to leave until we've got the BPR.
Yeah, exactly. There's probably not the generic answer is a bit kind of jazz hands vague about it, because it depends on you, it depends on your context, it depends on the other person. But broadly speaking, you want to have done your work, so you got some idea of what the answers are to the questions. You want to have given them every chance to have done some work as well. So the more you could sort of say, hey, this is not meant to freak you out, but I'm excited to be working with you, and I've just learned it's useful for us to have a conversation about how we best work together, rather than it's just, well, the temptation is just to plunge into the work. So I just like to have like a conversation, maybe 30 minutes, around just figuring out how we best work together. So that's really helpful. You're mostly trying to reassure the person that this isn't some weird intervention. It is actually a slightly weird intervention, but you're trying to pretend it's not.
It's not about performance. It's not about
performance.
Can be the other fears that come up.
Exactly. It's like, I just would like to make this work as best as I can for you. I think it's helpful. You could say, look, here are the 5 questions that I typically ask and answer, so I'll be thinking about my answers to this. If you want to have a think about some of your answers, that might be great as well. I'm constantly trying to give people choice. You can be more directive, but every time there's prizes and punishments to being more directive. You know, you're like, here are 5 questions. If you had to prepare one of them, I'd love you to prepare this one and that one. Or maybe if it's like, for me, if it's like, if you had to prepare just 2 of them, I'd love you to prepare the first one, who are you at your best, and the last one, how will we repair it when things go wrong. But you know, as you see fit, and in the book, there's kind of assorted scripts and stuff that you can kind of use and adapt.
Such great resources for at least to be able to see how that language might come together to pull it together. There's another kind of point that you make in there, and it frustrated me and liberated me at the same time, and that was, you don't have to solve anything from these conversations. And there is a part of me wanting to know that it's worked well, that I've done it right, that I've been exceptionally good at it, and that it's fundamentally from that day on changing everything. And that it was almost like, God damn, Michael, what do you mean? What's the point then if it's not going to, if there doesn't have to be an outcome from it? Yeah.
There is an outcome. The outcome's happened. The magic is in having the conversation. It doesn't have to finish with a nice, neat bow in the moment. What you've done in having a keystone conversation is given you both permission to keep talking about the relationship. You've said, we both care enough about this relationship that we might come back to it and check in on the health of it. That's the win. That's the win. All the stuff that gets said is in some ways kind of like helpful information, but it's
secondary to opening.
It's kind of almost secondary to I'm signaling that this working relationship between us is really important, and I'm willing to come back to it and ask about it. Now, obviously, it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes you're like, I have a keystone conversation, and then we get into a fight, and we never resolve it, and it's like, but you're just. So I say that because it doesn't always work, but it often does. So it's like, don't get disheartened when you do all this work and it's like, I didn't quite, it didn't turn this into a miraculously brilliant relationship. But you're just giving yourself the best chance to have a relationship that is fulfilling and useful and engaging for you, and offering that to the other person as well.
Maybe even if it's slightly more productive, or I've got a bit more of an insight and an awareness. What would be your encouragement if someone says, I just don't think there's any point. I feel like I've tried certain things and I just don't think it's going to go anywhere. Nothing's going to change.
Yeah, well, that might be true. So that might be one of your almost people. And I think when people are listening to this conversation, there are some people who go, for these 2 people, I should probably do this because that could be fun and it could be helpful. And it people tend to be a bit black and white about it, on or off. And it tends to be quite a lot of people who get lumped into I don't think I should bother with this. So it feels a bit hard or a bit awkward, or you're not totally sure how it's going to go. And what I hope is people will take more of a gamble on some of the maybes. Like, I'm fine. It's called How to Work with Almost Anyone. So I appreciate there's going to be some people where you're like, you know what? This person is terrible and I hate them, or it's just not worth it, or they're self-absorbed, or whatever the reason is. You're like, I just don't want to build that relationship. But, there's a relationship writer called John Gottman. The 7 Secrets of a Successful Marriage is his classic book. And I read a statistic from him, which is helpful because his stuff is very research-based. He said 70% of all issues in relationships are perpetual. They don't get fixed. And I find that a very optimistic number for 2 reasons. First is, I can stop trying to fix the 70%. It's taken me a very long time to realize that 70% is not fixable. It needs to be lived around and managed around and solved as this is the dynamic. So how will we now live with that dynamic? Like, and on a personal level, my wife and I have been partners for more than 30 years, married for almost 30 years. And we've just got some ways of behaving where I'm like, bit irritating, and it will be this way until one of us is dead. You know, I will go, hey, do you want to try this new restaurant? And she will say no. That's just what she does. She's like, why would I go to a new restaurant when I can go to an old one, which I know will be great? And I'm like, because it's new and because it's different and because it might be amazing. And even if it's not, we'll have a story to tell. Mm-hmm. She's like, nope. And so
I want the reliable.
Exactly. So we both know that dynamic, and we both know how to then come to a conclusion that often we will not be going to that restaurant. But occasionally we get to go to the new restaurants. So I think it's optimistic because for all these people going, what's the point? I won't bother. Mm-hmm. My guess is you're actually looking at the 70% of the stuff that won't change. And you're like, great, it won't change. And you get to figure out a way of working around it that might be more optimal. And it also says there's 30% that might change. Mm-hmm. You know, there's 30% that can be fixed. And what a conversation like this might do might help you solve some of the 30%. It doesn't have to, you're not trying to turn it into a unicorn burping rainbows. You're trying to make the best possible relationship with that person. If you can just make it 5% better, it might be worth a slightly awkward 45-minute conversation.
Worth jumping into that to just see, as you say, what might be possible or where that might go. One of the things we were talking about before, not only what do you put in these books, but it's also what you take out of it. What isn't there is telling the other person or the reason why this relationship hasn't been great to date.
Right. Yeah.
Is there any risk of that happening inside of these, and what do we do to be mindful of that and keep it back to, I guess, the future orientation, which is really what you're saying around the best possible relationship?
It is. That's a good question. I haven't thought about that. So I think there's every danger that a relationship like a conversation like this can go off the rails fast. Mm-hmm. And so there's a way that if you decide to have a keystone conversation, you want to match your vulnerability to the appropriate into the context. Mm-hmm. You know, if you've had a tough working relationship with this person for 2 years, you don't want to go, you know what will really work? Me being extremely vulnerable about this. Or it might. You know, it's like one of those choices you make. Every choice you make has prizes and punishments. So what you decide to say or not say, those are all choices, and you're kind of going, I'm taking a guess as to how this might play out. Mm-hmm. There's absolutely a way that this could just not be a success at all. It turns into a bit of a kind of finger pointing, you said, I said, you did, I did sort of thing. So you might go, if I'm really sure that's going to happen, maybe I shouldn't have this conversation. But it might be interesting to say, so what's the one question I would ask that would give us a chance of it being helpful? You know, you could say, hey, you know, Ali, we've been working for a couple of years, had our ups and downs around that. And I noticed that you and I occasionally end up kind of butting heads a little bit or in conflict. I thought it'd be useful for us to have a conversation about how do we fix it when things go off the rails with us. Because I think we're going to be working together for the next couple of years. And for me, it would be really helpful for us to figure out how to get back on track as fast as possible. So I'm wondering if you'd be up for a conversation where we just throw out some ideas and see if there's a way for us to get back to where we want to be more quickly than we're doing at the moment.
So valuable. Yeah.
That's a really limited version of this kind of keystone conversation, and it's a more selected of what's really possible, what's worth going for here. Because even if the person's like, you irritate the hell out of me, they're like, it would be good if we found a way back to working more easily, more quickly. Except for the people who are like, actually, I like the dysfunction. I like the drama.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in that.
The majority of times there's going to be, yes, I think there are things that we can do, and let's actually see if there is a common ground
if there's just
around that.
If you get one good tactic between the two of you, which is like, let's agree to do this. Yep. If this has happened, let's have a safe word where we're like, oh, we're doing the thing.
Yeah. Do
we want to just take 10 minutes to cool down so we break the cycle a little bit? that could be a huge win for both of you.
Takes the heat out of the experience as well. I can imagine that the energy that you bring, the state of mind that you bring to these conversations is just as important as well.
Yeah.
For yourself, when you've stepped into, whether it's these keystone conversations or conversations around relationships, what might be some of the tactical tools that you use to navigate your own energy, or even while you're kind of traveling or in the work that you do? What do you do to manage your own energy to be able to turn up at your best?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been thinking about it a lot because I've been helping my mum move out of the family home into a kind of care home for the last 2 months. And I'd be really, every time I would walk over to see her, I'd feel a certain melange of emotions, not all of which were shiny, happy ones. And so I've been thinking about that and kind of practicing it for the last 2 months. The first is, I've got a number of things that go through my mind. The first is to understand that people respond to the strongest signal in the room. So my job is to be the strongest signal in the room and to be a signal of generosity and kindness and presence. People have mirror neurons in their brain, and they will just, the chemicals in their body will quickly match the chemicals of the person who has the strongest energy. So be that person and be generous and kind and open about it. So that's part of what I do. And I use some very kind of physically based stuff around that, everything from having my feet on the ground as much as possible, that kind of groundedness. I'm a very in my head person. I'm not that good at somatic wisdom, but I try. And one of the tactics I learned from a friend of mine called Mark Bowden is just where you put your hands. So I typically have my hands at my belly button height, even when I'm sitting. Like this whole interview, I've kind of had my hands down here because it's a way of having my body in its calmest, most open space. He has a TEDx talk. His name is Mark Bowden, Bowden, and he has a great TEDx talk about this and just how your position of your hands makes all the difference to the energy in the room. Yeah. His company's called Truth Plane. And then the third thing I try and get really clear on is, what do I want? Like, if I know what I want in a conversation, it just helps me orient to remembering what the game is I'm playing here rather than getting distracted in the drama of it, because there's always drama to distract you from it. But this idea of what's the one thing that I want from this interaction, and it doesn't have to be a tangible takeaway. It could just be, I just want to be as generous and as present as possible. That helps me manage my energy around that as well.
Yeah, so important to kind of be in our body, but also just that.
Yeah.
What do I want to bring to this, and what's the signal that I can bring for other people, and the power and the influence of that. How to Work with Almost Anyone, best book title, phenomenal. We will put links, but how can people connect and follow some of your work?
Well, if you're interested in the new book, How to Work with Almost Anyone, bestpossiblerelationship.com has a download of the questions and also a video of me conducting a Keystone conversation with Ainsley, somebody I work with. If you want more general stuff, my website is mbs.works. So that gives you doorways to all of the books and all of the kind of free stuff in all of those books. And you can find my social media stuff there and as well if you're keen.
Love this conversation. I'm going to come to the final question. The name of this podcast is called Standout Life. When you hear that term, what does it mean to you to live a standout life?
I think what it comes to mind for me is, this is taught to me by a woman called Madeline Blanchard, who is kind of connected to the famous Blanchard family. And she had been a stage performer before kind of getting into the world of coaching and all of that good stuff. And I remember her giving a talk, and she said, make sure you step into the spotlight. he said half the problem with performers is they don't know where the spotlight is, and that they're like only half lit. So whatever the spotlight is for you and whatever the stage is that you're on, it's like get into the spotlight so that you get to stand out.
Whatever the stage is, whatever that is for you. I love that sense of stepping into the spotlight. Don't be half lit.
Yeah, exactly. Don't be half lit. There's at least two meanings to that, but yeah.
This has been remarkable. Thank you so much, Michael.
Of course, my pleasure.